Welcome, folks, to another successful conference and forum and expo here. My laptop just died, so my notes were on there. I'm going to wing this a bit. I think what's important is to realize, for those of us that travel, and I know many of you guys do, and you hear different stories across the country, and one of those older stories was self-determination, right? Like you hear that, what do they mean by that? You know, since the 80s, I think the first time I came down to Thunder Bay in 1990, there was the Royal Commission of Aboriginal People. And there was a lot of focus on the political. You know, there was a lot of focus on the social conditions. There was a very little focus on economics and economic development. There was a very specific paper that was submitted from RBC called The Cost of Doing Nothing. Think about that, the cost of doing nothing. If we didn't do anything, then what would be the total cost of managing the Indigenous affairs in Canada, right, kind of thing. So I think that sparked a lot of discussions across the country on what is self-determination. You can't have first world governments with third world economies. You just can't, right? And so those of us that was in the space in the 80s and 90s and working around economic development with First Nations. I worked at Anishinaabe ASCII Development Fund right out of university. Very privileged, very privileged space. You know, I was the partnership development advisor. Very unique program under the Harris government that they funded across Ontario. There was 15 of us. And we were brokering deals depending on the market and the region we were in. In my case, it was Thunder Bay and Northwestern Ontario. It was natural resource development. Just fresh out of university, you know, pretty green, naive, and just thought I can do this. And went out and you know, got battle scarred like the rest of us doing these things. But realizing that, I didn't know at the time, but realizing that there's so much opportunity. Like nothing constrained us, you know, realizing when you're in the world of commerce that it's unlimited. You know, the only thing that regulates you is the government. But when it comes to Indigenous economic determination, so that's sort of where my thinking began. With financing, developmental lending, later corporate financing, and later project financing in Northwestern Ontario. So when you think about aspirations, you know, Indigenous aspirations, right? Like you have to look at the presupposition around that. Indigenous aspiration assumes, right, autonomy. Like it assumes agency. And I think what you hear today across the country, and you hear some examples here, they're like, Indigenous people don't want to be victims of development. They want to be agents of development. Not at any cost, you know, but there's going to be, they're going to finding the middle way, I guess, dealing with resource development, traditional resource users, and resource regulators in this country. And I guess I've been privileged in the last 25 years or so, seeing that trend line across the country, seeing, you know, managing programs, you know, of Indigenous affairs, to what you're seeing now, managing wealth. You know, a different set of problems. You know, what are we going to do with this, and with the money that we have, and with the opportunities that are at our feet. And I think it's a natural progression. It's a natural progression because I grew up in Timmins, in Schumacher. I didn't know anybody that owned a car. Literally, I came out of the Winnipeg First Nation, the Hudson Bay coastline. Nobody in my immediate circles had a car, not even a used car. And it wasn't until later, you know, my uncle had a used car, a big American white Boss Hog car, he called it. That was the first time. And it probably took another 7 or 8 years, but I found a car owner and an Indigenous homeowner Like, I didn't know anybody that owned a home. It was all my non-native French friends at O'Gorman High School in Timmins that had their parents own homes. And I said, you can actually own homes? I didn't know you can own homes. And it wasn't until I moved to Thunder Bay for university, I actually found Indigenous business owners. So from car owners to homeowners to business owners, it's not a big jump from that to project owners. And that's where Indigenous communities are going. They're actually equity owners in these major undertakings across Canada. Right from BC, the mega developments, this is multi-billion-dollar real estate developments, to the Mi'kmaq, taking over the fishing industry on the East Coast and everything in between. And that's what excites me, when it comes to the mineral mining sector, because everything in between is minerals. It's like, from coast to coast. So I thought I'd just share some slides, for us to look at. You want to flip it? Oh, the previous one. Oh, am I doing this? Am I in control? Okay. There you go. So I remember, you guys must remember when we celebrated, what is it, 2010 or whatever it was, what, $2.2 billion spent across Canada. And Northern Ontario had $1.1 billion of that exploration spend. I remember that. It was like a threshold, on the exploration spend across Canada. The reason I totally remember because I was busy as shit. There was projects everywhere. Exploration money was being spent despite the 2008 crash. The commodity cycle was still going. And look at where we are now. So last year, when I did this last year, it was 3.7, but the actual became 3.9 billion. The intended spend this year, the greens, the exploration companies, the juniors, and then the senior companies spend is the bottom blue. And then you can see it across Canada. Ontario actually regained its first place status. Quebec beat us a few years ago. A lot of us were heartbroken because all that money went to Quebec, not Ontario, but it's now back in Ontario. And you can see the last 3 years, I don't know if I can see it here, but it's 1.1 billion intended spending in Ontario. Manitoba is interesting too because there's a lot of action there now in northern Manitoba getting pulled up there. But it's exciting times. I know some of you guys not that exciting because it depends how good you're at raising financing and some of the issues that you may face today. What's interesting is that the Aboriginal law, as it advanced across the country, the other regulators didn't catch up. So as you guys know that do flow-through financing, as you're raising the financing, there was eligible expenses when it came to Indigenous consultation. Those eligible expenses was actually pre-permit. But you had the Crown telling you, go engage early and often, but you couldn't expense all that money in the beginning. And it took a lot of effort. I spent 10 years on the PDAC board lobbying Ottawa, change your rules. All your governments across Canada is saying engage early and often with the Indigenous communities, but it was all expense. It was all expenses, pure expenses all the way. So they actually changed the rules now, where you can actually write off through your flow-through finance eligible expenses on the consultation now. That took effort. This is again a disjointed governmental system we have in Canada. And it takes effort. It really does take effort to make everything kind of aligned so that everybody can benefit, that the balance of interest is fair for everyone. So I just point this out because that took time. That did not exist. And a lot of you guys know that deal with financing, that this actually eased a bit, right? I won't talk about permits because... So this is just a map. If you go to NRCan, Natural Resource Canada's website, if you Google Natural Resource Canada, Indigenous Indigenous Communities agreement. If you just Google that, Indigenous Interactive Map Agreements, a map will come up, an interactive map with layers. This is the layer on that map with all the Indigenous communities. This is the layer with all the agreements that they know. Known agreements by NRCan. They've been tracking this for almost probably 12 years, ever since the Harper government, trying to put in place the evolution, because the mining and exploration sector is, I would argue, probably the most advanced historically doing deals with Indigenous communities. When you think of all the other sectors that kind of resisted to do that, they were kind of forced to because of Supreme Court decisions since 2024. Prior to that, you know, it wasn't regulated or legislated. You got to do deals with First Nations. It was actually the mineral mining sector, their own best practice, putting agreements in place, basically papering the relationship and governing the relationship and the type of activities between the companies' activities and the community's utilization patterns of the land. So the reconciliation that you hear today, I would, if you reframed what's happened in the last, 15 years across Canada, I would say the mineral mining sector has been the leading edge of economic reconciliation in Canada, in terms of papering things on the ground and offering opportunities. So I remember the first. This is relatively new, right? Because I remember the first type of agreements with communities. It was almost like access agreements. You put up some paper down. The compensation, loss of use of land, and temporary or otherwise, and it was sort of pay and play type of thing. Then it kind of evolved. The public and junior, because the juniors are restricted by security law. They can only do so much within the framework they're operating in. There's only allowable things. So one of those things in consideration of those things was offering services in exchange, for either warrants or shares, and other considerations the juniors can offer, right? So they started, okay, well, you guys got fuel? Maybe we can buy fuel from you. You got workers at the camps. So I saw that sort of probably 20 years ago when I was at NADF, National Army Development Fund, and I was helping with these things, and that was the beginning 20 years ago. And then it evolved to First Nations setting up their Economic Development Corp. Okay, this is actually business activities. Let's set up an Ecodev Corp that manages that, right, or at least planned for that, and then that becomes the counterparty. I remember, I think it was Tribute Mineral Resources. They were the first one going to the Security Exchange, the Toronto Stock Exchange, wondering if the First Nations is legally the counterparty for shares. So when you issue shares, you got to have a legal entity on the other side. And First Nations is this very ambiguous legal entity, if you want to call it a legal entity. In fact, some will say it's not a legal entity. It's a government. And so the Security Exchange had to figure that out. Can we actually issue shares to a First Nations? Not a First Nations Ecodev Corp, but to a First Nations kind of thing. So that was like in 2008, 2009. So again, the evolution of First Nations participating in the mineral mining sector, hitting the walls of rules, right? Wondering how do we deal with this? Because it wasn't considered when these rules were set up. And then I see my good friend, oh my God, my brain just went, Mary. My first trip to Quebec, I did a charter. I brought in 4 or 5 First Nations. I think it was Sandy Lake, Casablanca, Cat Lake, other remote communities, and took a charter across the bay in Attawapskat. We visited the community Wimagee, that Mary was actually the geologist, the resident geologist of Wimagee First Nations, to look at what Wimagee was doing in Quebec. And so they had their own Wimagee Exploration Inc., their own private co, in a way, and their own regional geological center, whereby they had included their trappers. So the trappers would go out, get some samples or chip some rock away along their trap lines, bring it in, and then Mary would help facilitate the assay results, come back if there was some, indicator minerals or whatever, then they would stake it 50-50, 50 for mineral exploration, 50 for the trappers. It was pretty neat. And in Ontario, that's about the same time that they started doing training. And Peter, you were around when they started doing prospectors training for First Nations in Sioux Lookout. So I was, it was the Boreal Prospector Association at the time, and we were doing training, getting communities to you guys can do this, some grassroots exploration. So Mary back then, I remember Chief Eno Anderson goes, I just saw my future. I seriously just saw, this is how, because Casablanca First Nation sits on a greenstone belt. And he goes, this is what I want to do. And about 17 years later, they have a mineral corp. They have their own drill, believe it or not. And they actually have some Bay Street advisors sitting on their board, moving. It's quiet, right? It's, they're doing their own work. They're hitting the same situations as any other junior, when it comes to financing and marketing and all that kind of stuff. So that is the evolution, of Indigenous communities getting involved in the mineral mining sector in Canada. So they set up Active Corps, they started training their own prospectors. This is interesting, right? So the inspiration of Wimagee that Mary was talking about, what stops First Nations setting up their own junior exploration companies? You can hire your own geologist. No? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to joint venture, Just like the communities that are actually involved in junior exploration companies, they're going to come up like any other junior. We need money. We can't cut the $2 million check for the exploration program, right? We're going to have to join venture. They can earn in with the, just like any other deal flow when it comes to mineral exploration. Oh, am I zero? I'm at zero. Okay. It's okay. I get excited about this. The ultimate dream is actually taking a private co, and I'm going to talk to Jason about this, because I think I have an underlying asset, is actually taking, the reason I'm taking the liberties is because I think Derek Chum is going to be late. So it's cutting into his time, and Jason can have more time. But I say this because I actually believe in it. That not only they can do this, have their own junior, and actually setting up their own properties, because anybody with a credit card can go online and actually stake right now. So I have a prospector's license, pretty easy to get. You just go online, do the exercise, and issue it, and then you can actually start staking. I actually wanted to do that and staked around Muskoka area, but they changed the rules. You can't do that. Who's this Indigenous guy prospecting around our area? Just so we get a sense of the feel what happens up north. Oops. I think not only do you see pockets of this activity across Canada, but I think the next step, and I know Derek is here because I talked to him, Teven. In my mind, I think First Nations can actually set up a junior with some pretty good assets in their area, do the work, get the program going, and actually go through initial public offering. I think the underwriters out there would do it. To put together a First Nations juniors and go public. It'd be the first one. I want to do it. That's why I'm telling you that. And be the first Indigenous IPO. It costs about $1 million. I've talked to IPO lawyers on to take, you can do a reverse takeover. It's not the same, but to go all the way through an IPO and be the first. And I think that'd be a milestone in Canada for actually getting involved and understanding the reality of mineral exploration, mineral financing, and mineral development. Get you, Miigwech. Thanks.